Western Canadian grower groups and the federal government have partnered on providing funding for wheat research to the tune of more than $20 million over 5 years.
Canada has always been an agricultural heavyweight, even if it never fully acted like one. From endless wheat fields to canola-rich plains and potash deposits that feed farms around the world, the prairies quietly carried global food security on their shoulders. But for decades, nearly all of that power flowed through someone else's hands. Canadian grain rode American railways, Canadian fertilizer passed through U.S. ports, and Canadian farmers paid foreign gatekeepers to reach global markets. It worked until it didn't. Everything shifted in early 2025, when Mark Carney stood before Saskatchewan growers and asked a question that cut straight to the bone. Why was a country this rich still outsourcing its own access to the world? That moment collided with rising trade threats from Washington, including tariffs aimed directly at prairie livelihoods. Suddenly, a system people had tolerated for generations felt risky, even fragile. Behind the scenes, plans began moving fast. An overlooked Arctic port came back into focus. Supply chains started changing direction. A massive trade network began quietly rewiring itself. What started as frustration turned into strategy, and strategy turned into action. So, how did Canada flip the script this quickly? Who stands to gain, who gets pushed aside, and what happens when a nation finally decides to control its own future? Canada's influence over the global food supply has always been larger than most people realize. Across the prairies, wheat stretches farther than the eye can follow. Canola moves in endless rail cars. Deep beneath Saskatchewan sits the largest potash reserve on Earth. These resources do more than support local economies. They hold up modern agriculture worldwide. Potash feeds fertilizer systems that nearly half the planet depends on. Without it, harvests collapse, prices spike, and food insecurity spreads fast. Canada currently supplies around 32% of the world's potash and controls more than 40% of global exports, with another 1.1 billion tons still underground. Wheat exports add roughly $11.5 billion each year, with nearly 28 million tons shipped to over 80 countries. Canada leads the world in high-protein wheat quality. Canola, barley, oats, lentils, peas, and specialty crops expand that reach even further. By 2023, agricultural exports surpassed $99 billion, with steady growth projected year after year. By any measure, Canada ranks among the most powerful food producers on Earth, yet the path those products travel tells a very different story. Most Western Canadian grain moves through Vancouver, a port struggling under congestion, labor disruptions, and rising costs. Huge volumes also cross south into the United States before ever touching ocean water. Fertilizer mined in Saskatchewan rides American rail networks to American ports before reaching international buyers. Every transfer collects fees for U.S. logistics firms that neither grow crops nor mine fertilizer, but profit from controlling the routes. For decades, this setup was treated as inefficient but unavoidable. Vancouver offered year-round Pacific access. Eastern shipping through the St. Lawrence added weeks to transit times. Alternative routes existed on maps, not in practice. Over time, dependence hardened into routine, and routine became assumption. Then politics entered the equation. When Donald Trump threatened sweeping tariffs on Canadian agriculture, including a proposed 25% levy on grain and new fees aimed at fertilizer exports, the cost of dependence stopped feeling abstract. These moves put prairie livelihoods at risk overnight. Decisions made in Washington could now hit Canadian farmers directly, enforced through infrastructure Canada did not own. What once felt like an inconvenience began to look like exposure. That realization forced a different question. Not whether Canada had agricultural power, but why it had surrendered control over how that power reached the world. The answer had been sitting in the far north for nearly a century. The port of Churchill was built in the 1930s as a gateway to Europe through Hudson Bay. It offered a shipping route thousands of kilometers shorter than passed through Vancouver or U.S. ports. The rail line connected directly to prairie production zones. The harbor could handle deep water vessels. On paper, Churchill should have transformed Canadian exports. Instead, it faded into neglect. Chronic underfunding kept operations limited to a short seasonal window. Cargo volumes stayed low. By the late 20th century, the port was viewed more as a relic than a strategic asset. In 1997, Ottawa sold Churchill and its 1,300-kilometer rail line to American company Omnitrax for $1. Investment slowed even further. Maintenance slipped. When flooding damaged the rail line in 2017, Omnitrax walked away. Churchill went silent. In 2018, a coalition of 41 First Nations communities and northern Manitoba towns stepped in, purchasing the port and railway under a new entity called Arctic Gateway Group. The move carried symbolic weight, but few believed it would revive large-scale trade. The port's commercial future looked doubtful. Then the global landscape shifted. Shipping costs climbed, Vancouver congestion worsened. American trade policy grew unpredictable. Climate change extended Hudson Bay's navigable season. Gradually, what once seemed impractical began to feel timely. The moment everything changed arrived in March 2025. Genesis Fertilizers, a Saskatchewan-based company planning a major nitrogen fertilizer facility, announced a partnership with Arctic Gateway Group. The strategy was straightforward. Raw materials like phosphate and ammonium sulfate would arrive through Churchill. Finished fertilizer would ship out through the same port. No American rail, no U.S. ports. Genesis projected annual production of 1 million tons of fertilizer, requiring about 300,000 tons of phosphate imports. Historically, those inputs moved through the United States. Under this new model, they would not. The Hudson Bay route connects directly to Atlantic shipping lanes, cutting distance and cost compared to sending freight west to Vancouver and around South America, or navigating American terminals and the Panama Canal. The decision wasn't framed as political. It was economic. Shorter routes lowered logistics costs. Canadian-controlled infrastructure reduced exposure to foreign policy swings. Supply chains became simpler and more predictable. Once that logic held for fertilizer, the implications for agriculture were impossible to ignore. Saskatchewan's fertilizer industry alone generates billions each year. If one producer could redesign its entire supply chain around Churchill, others could follow. Grain presented an even larger opportunity. Canada exports nearly 29 million tons of grain annually through Vancouver. Churchill historically handled only a small fraction of that, not because demand was lacking, but because infrastructure wasn't built to support volume. Arctic Gateway Group's approach was not to replace Vancouver overnight. The goal was to unlock trade that could not exist without northern capacity. That vision took shape through the Port of Churchill Plus project. Plans include modern grain handling equipment, expanded storage, upgraded loading systems, and increased rail capacity. Icebreaker support could stretch the shipping season from roughly 4 months toward near year-round operations. With these upgrades, Churchill becomes viable for consistent large-scale exports. The route to Europe through Hudson Bay saves about 6 days compared to Vancouver. For traders and buyers, that time translates directly into money through lower transport costs, reduced spoilage risk, and better market timing. More importantly, it keeps Canadian exports fully inside Canadian control from farm to port. Wheat and canola grown in Saskatchewan move on Canadian railways, ship through a Canadian Arctic port, and reach European markets without passing through American systems. Fees that once flowed south stay home. Logistics authority shifts back to domestic operators. Independence stops being theoretical and becomes operational. This is where the widely cited $780 billion figure enters the conversation. It does not represent Canada's entire agricultural economy, nor does it assume Vancouver disappears. It reflects the estimated value of trade that could realistically transition to Arctic routes over roughly a decade.